Hashem, today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin daf Chaf Dalet, Sanhedrin 24, and we're going to start on the last line on Chaf Gimel Amabez on 23b. There's a lot to cover today's daf yomi, but we first say that the daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim, Matzah for the Shuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael in this Eis Tzara. So the Gemara has been discussing that the fact that according to Rabbi Meir, he said one litigant can disqualify first the judges of the other litigant, and then it says he could disqualify the witnesses. Now we had seen that there was a discussion whether the text says witnesses or witness, and we've seen different explanations how he's able to do that. So the Gemara says ki asa Ravin. So last explanation, final explanation, we've seen Rav Dimi. When Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and now we see the explanation of Ravin. Ki asa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Reisha, he says the explanation is as follows, on top of Daled Amud Aleph. The first clause of the Mishnah, which says you could disqualify the judges, that's talking about a case of Eidim Psulin, V'dayan and Kesher, and that's talking about a case where the judges were kosher, but the witnesses were disqualified for other reasons. And meaning to say, it was very clear that the witnesses were disqualified. And since he's believed to disqualify the witnesses, because it's obviously the case that they're disqualified, so therefore, because he was correct in disqualifying the witnesses, we also allow him to disqualify the judges. And we say migu de pasli aid him, because since he was correct in disqualifying the witnesses, pasli nami dayani. Therefore, we're going to allow him to just disqualify the judges on the same slate. And so therefore, that's why he's able to disqualify the judges. And Seifa, and the concluding clause is B'dayanim psulim ve'edim ksherim. And hold on one second. So the concluding clause is where he came and disqualified the judges, and the witnesses were kosher, but we say the migu de pasli dayanin, since he was able to disqualify the judges, his words were correct there, pasli nami edim. Therefore, we also allow him to disqualify the witnesses. And this is the concept of migu, that since we believed him on one thing, we're going to believe him on something else. It's not typically the way we say the word migu means throughout Shas. Typically, migu throughout Shas means, oh, if I was going to say this, I could have made a better this. I could have made a better lie. But here we're saying that, no, since we believe him on one thing, we believe him on the other thing. It's not the typical way we translate migu throughout Shas. So Mazkif or Rava, so Rava challenges Ravin. He says, Bishlam amigo de Patli Aiden Patli Namidayani. I understand, in the first clause of the Mishnah, that because he disqualifies the witnesses, he's also able to disqualify the judges. It's no big deal. He could be Dini Achrina because there's other judges he could pick. El amigo de Pasli Dayani. Pasli Nami Adim. But since he disqualifies the judges, he's going to be also able to disqualify the witnesses. He has no other witnesses to choose. So why is this person, the other litigant, he's losing his witnesses, and that's not his fault. So the Gemara says, no, there's only one set of, there's two sets of witnesses. But if there would be no, so the Gemara says, so there's only one set of witnesses, we wouldn't allow him, they wouldn't be able to disqualify. So the Gemara says, so at the end of the day, Ravin is saying that the only time there's a dispute between Rabbi Meir and the Rabbanon is if there's two sets of witnesses, which was actually also what Rav Dimi said yesterday. So the Gemara says, I know to Rav Dimi. Well, that's in effect what Rav Dimi said yesterday, even though Rav Dimi got there for a different reasoning. Rav Dimi got there because he said the dispute is about tzarach levarer or not, whether or not you have to substantiate your words. So if that's the case, but in the essence, they're saying the same thing. So the Gemara says, no, iko benayo, the distinction between them is migu. And marasav amina migu, and marasav amina migu. Ravin says we say this concept of migu in general, meaning to say, since he's saying this, he's also believed to be saying something else. Whereas Rav Dimi does not say this concept of migu in general. Says the Gemara, let's analyze the statement that we had said, that Rabbi Meir had said you could just disqualify the witnesses of the other litigant. And Reish Lakish said, Pek Kodesh Yomar Davar Zeh. Will such a holy person say these words? He couldn't believe that Rabbi Meir had said that. And so therefore, he says Pekodesh Yomer Davar Zeh, he said, how could such a holy person say this? And so therefore, for that reason, he said that what we're talking about here is we're talking about not two witnesses that he could disqualify, but rather whether or not he's able to matzi hadirei. That whether or not he's able to recant his position. The Rameir says he can recant after he willingly accepted it, the one witness, and Rabbanan say he can. So the Gemara says, "Gufa Amar Reish Lakish Pek Kodesh Yomer Davar Zeh Tani Edo." Any, is this really the case that Reish Lakish speaks like this? That when he comes across a position of a colleague, which he vehemently disagrees with, he refers him in such a respectful manner. Such a holy mouth would say this. Amar Ula Roas Reish Lakish but makes mendrash. Somebody who ever says Ula, if you ever saw Reish Lakish and makes mendrash, Kilu Oker Harim V'Tovnon Zebedeh. It's like he's uprooting the mountains and grinding them against each other. So the Gemara says, Amar Ravina, meaning to say that he's destroying them. And we see from here he's so sharp. And why is he calling Rabbi Meir in act of humility the Pak Kadosh? So the Gemara answers, Amar Ravina, V'awol kol haroa Rabbi Meir v'es medrash kilu oker arayarim v'tochnen zeh b'zeh. So Ravina says, why? What's the shock? But Rabbi Meir was also Oker Haram here, meaning to say he was even stronger, meaning to say that Rabbi Meir was himself lifting up the mountain. So Rabbi Meir was even sharper than Reish Lakish. And so therefore Reish Lakish called Rabbi Meir Pekadosh because he says this person is even greater than me. So therefore the Gemara says, no, that wasn't the question. That wasn't the shock that we had about Reish Lakish. What was the shock that we had about Reish Lakish? But rather, come just the opposite. Come and see how much the Talmidei Chachamim of the land of Israel honor each other. Because Reish Lakish, even though he was so sharp, he honored Rabbi Meir and he called him a Pek Kadosh, a holy mouth. And he wanted to explain the Sugya, the Mishnah, so that Rabbi Meir, there's no question on Rabbi Meir. Here the Yosef Rebbe, the Amar Asar Lahatman, like one time Rebbe was sitting and he said, now on Shabbos, there's a general prohibition of insulating food to keep it warmer. But Rabbi said, not only are you not allowed to insulate food to keep it you're not warmer because you might come to stir the coals, but you're also not allowed to insulate food to keep it colder, like a cold drink, to make it colder because you might come to insulate hot food. And Amar Fana Rabbi Shimon bar Rabbi Yossi, Abba Hitir Lahatmin Esaksonin. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yossi, said, actually, my father, Rabbi Yossi, when he was alive, he allowed insulating of cold food. Amar Lei, when they said to him, Kvar Horazakin. So Rebbe said, oh, now I hear that Rabbi Yossi ruled this way. Well, this is a proof that we're allowed to insulate cold food. I retract. So Amar Papa Borei Kamachavim Zevet. Look how much they honored each other. You, Rabbi Yossi Kayem, if Rabbi Yossi would be alive, Vayakaf Yosef ne Rebbe. Rabbi Yossi viewed himself as a student of Rebbe. Da Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yossi Mimalin Makaman Vosefava Vayakaf Yosef ne Rebbe, because Rabbi Shimon was just filling the place of his father, and he was standing there humbly before his father, before Rebbe. Before Rebbe. So that proves that his father was humble before Rebbe. And Rebbe still said, V'ka'amar kfar horazaki. And Rebbe still said, look, the elder has already ruled. Amar B'shaya ma'idachsev. What is, so it says, Rebbe B'shaya, what does the verse mean when it says about the prophecy of Zechariah? V'kachli shnei makot. I'll take two sticks. V'achar karasi Noam. To one of them I'll call Noam. V'achar karasi chobim. To one I'll call sweet, and the other one I'll call the attacker. What does this mean? Who's sweet and who's the attacker? Oh yeah, I skipped on. And the Noam is the Torah scholars of Eretz Yisrael who are sweet to each other with respect to halacha. Chovim, the assaulters, these are Torah scholars in Babylon, that they're always assaulting each other in halacha. Shnei b'nei Yitzhar omdim, and this is also in the prophecy of Zechariah, which I believe we read 2 weeks ago on Shabbos Chanukah. I don't know if we stopped right before it. They said these are the two olive trees that are standing, and it says Shneim zeisim alad. This part we definitely read Pasuk Gimel and Parak Dalet. There were two olive trees above it, and the olive went straight into the bowl. So what does this mean? Yitzar. I'm Rabbi Yitzchak. Elu Talmidei Chachamim Sheberetz Yisrael. Means the Torah scholars of Israel that they're so nice to each other like olive oil. And there are two olive branches above it. That they are harsh for each other, bitter like an olive. So this is what this is how we understand the verses. And now the Gemara says, because we're talking about the prophecy of Zechariah that talked about something something bad about Babylon, the Gemara continues. I lifted up my eyes and I saw. There were two women who went out, will come out. The ruach become fame, and the spirit was in their wings. Vilahena they had wings like the stork. And they carried the ephah. Ephah is a measuring utensil. Between the heaven and the earth. And says Zechariah, I said to the angel who was speaking to me, where are they bringing this measuring utensil? They're going to establish a place for Eretz Shinar, which is Babylon. Why were they going there? These two women are chanufa, which is like flattery, or basically chanufa is like that you trick others into thinking you're better than you are, and the gasus aruach, an arrogant, sheyardu above. So chanufa, flattery, or fakery and arrogance, they both went down to Bavel. And the Gemara asks the question, the gasus aruach of Bavel nachas, did arrogance go down to Babylon? We had this in Kedushin. There are 10 measures of arrogance, yardu olam. Tisha nata elam. 9 of them took elam. The achas kolam kulo. Elam is Persia. Persia got 9/10 of the arrogance, and the rest, the whole world was combining together. So why do we say that these two just went to Babylon? They went to Elam really. It started off in Babylon, and then it went to the rest of to Elam. It says to build for her, meaning to say in the singular, meaning to say that only one of the measurements of arrogance stayed in Babylon. Shema minav. Amar Mar. Is that really the case? Simon agaso saruach va'anios, and the sign for arrogance is poverty, and va'anios l'bavel nachas, and poverty went down to Babylon. So how can we say it's in Elam? So the Babylon has arrogance. So Gemara says, "Ma'anios." What does it mean? What does it mean that there's poverty? Anios b'Torah. It means that there's poverty in Torah. And that's what it means. In Elam, there was poverty of Torah. So the Gemara says, as it states, so when it says that Elam has arrogance, it means it has poverty of Torah. Says our daughter is small and she has no breast. This refers to Elam that merited to study Torah but not to teach Torah. So then the Gemara says, and this refers to, according to Rashi, this refers to Mordechai and Daniel, that they learned for themselves but they did not teach others. But in Babylon was Ezra, who taught Torah to many people. My Bavel, where do we get the name Bavel? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Belula b'Mikra, Belula b'Mishnah, Belula b'Talmud. Bavel means it's saturated with Bible, with Mishnah and Talmud. And Rabbeinu Tam says, this is why, even though the Gemara says in Avodah Zarah that a person is supposed to divide their life into thirds, studying a third of Bible, a third of Mishnah, a third of Talmud, we just need to study the Bavli because the Bavli has everything in it. And that's why if you do the Daf Yomi, you're studying Bible, Mishnah, and Talmud. And then the Gemara says also about Babylon, as it says in Echon, the darkness he led me like the dead of the world. So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah, Zed Talmudish Babel. This is the Talmud of Babylon, which is compared to dark. Because those people, Rashi says, those who learn there, they're always fighting with each other. And so therefore they have a lot of questions about the Talmud, like somebody who's feeling around in the dark. Comes to the Mishnah, Amar lo neman alai abba neman alai avicha, a person is coming to the court and he has a case, and he says, I trust my father, your father, to be a judge. I trust these three shepherds. Rameir says Yachol Asabro. Rameir says he can recant his declaration. And he says, I no longer accept him. Chum say he can't. We'll see what this means in the Gemara. Let's say he owed his friend an oath. His friend says, you don't have to take a formal oath on a Torah scroll. Just swear to me by your head, which is a much less significant oath. Meir says, Meir says he can recant. Chum say he can't. Amar Avdimi Berei, the Rav Nachman Berei, the Rav Yosef. What are we talking about when he says, I believe your father or my father is a judge? Going to Kibbutz Bechad. They have two other kosher judges, and he says, I'll just accept him as one judge. And Amar one of the three. And even though there are two others, Rameir says he could still go back. Amar Rav Yehuda Rashmuel Machokas ben Macholcha. So Rav Yehuda says the dispute between Rameir, he says to come back, is only in a case where he says, I waive my right to, he says, where he's saying, I am making a claim against you that you have to pay me money. And the person who's making the claim says, I'm allowing this disqualified person to be a judge. Where there he's saying, I'm waiving my claims. So there, we're not forcing him to give anything after he waived his claims. But that's where there's a dispute. There, a mayor says he can go back, and the Chumrim say he cannot go back. That's what the Rabbanan say he can't go back, because since the person who's the defendant, he has it in his hands, and so therefore you want to get it from him. Therefore he can't go back on his claim. Whereas Rav Meir says he can. But if it would be at Tenelcha, I'll give it to you. Everybody would say, Yochel Achsar. Everybody would say, if the person who's being claimed says, if your father or my father is a judge, I'll give it to you, then everybody was saying that he could go back, because there he has to give it up from his possession, so therefore we say for sure he could go back on it. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, where he says, I'll give it to you, that's where there's a dispute between Rameir and the Rabbanan. What does that mean? What is Rabbi Yochanan saying? Is Rabbi Yochanan saying that in the case of Etenelcha is a dispute, but in case of Macholcha, everybody's saying he's not able to go back? O Dilma, or perhaps Bein Bezu Macholkas, or everybody's saying that the dispute is in both cases. We're on the bottom of 24a. We're right in the middle of a sugya, but I'm sure you'll catch up. So the Gemara says, meaning say, what's Rabbi Yochanan actually saying in that case? Is he saying, we know he's saying the dispute is by Etancha, but does he also say there's a dispute by Macholcha? And then the Gemara says, now, Rava is going to try and answer this question about what exactly, we're 5 lines from the bottom. Rava says the dispute is by, I will give it to you. Now that's where there's a dispute of but where I'll waive you, where the plaintiff is waiving his rights. Everybody's saying he can't go back under those circumstances. Now, so it's possible to read it that Rava is saying that by Etenelcha is a dispute, so by Macholcha everybody says you can't go back. Then Rava is saying like Rabbi Yochanan, Eli Amras Bein Bezu Machokas. But if Rava is saying there's a dispute in both cases, both in Etenelcha and Macholcha, Rava Amar Kaman, then who is Rava's position like? So the Gemara says, Rava Taimadin Avshei Kamer. No, Rava is saying we can't learn from here what's Rava's position, what Rabbi Yochanan's position, because Rava is saying his own opinion. The Gemara again is trying to figure out what's Rabbi Yochanan saying. And the Gemara is actually now challenging Rava, because what did Rava say? Rava says the dispute is by Etenelcha, but by Macholcha, even Rabbi Meir would say you can't go back. So the Gemara says, Eitzvei Rav Acha bar Tachlifa Rava. So Rav Acha bar Tachlifa challenged Rava, Yachayv l'chaver shvua, va'amar lo dorli b'chayi roshcha. It says in the Mishnah, it says if you're a friend, you owe your friend an oath, and he says, you don't have to give an oath with a Torah. Just give me a lesser oath. And Meir Omer Yachol Achsar, but Meir says you go back, and and Chum say you can't go back. So that's for sure a case of Macholcha. And Rabbi Meir is still saying there, you can go back. So therefore, how can Rava say that even Rabbi Meir was saying Yachol Achzerbo? So the Gemara says, My lav ba'osen on Nishbam lo Mishalman. Isn't that the case of where the person is saying, I'll take an oath and then I won't pay? And he's saying, take this oath and you won't have to pay me. So it's a case of Macholacha on top of Chaftawan on base. And Gemara says, no, ba'osen on Nishbam and Notlin. No, it's it's a case of etelcha. It's taking an oath and taking money. Now I have a like etelcha. Gemara said, but if that would be the case, if they're both etelcha, why would you have to list both cases in the Mishnah? That you're listing the same case twice. We already had the case in the first clause. Gemara says, no, they're two separate cases. One is the case of a judge, and one is the case of an oath. And Tana Torah b'das acherem and Tana Torah b'das atzmo. He's saying that I am that basically one is he's saying his obligation depends upon others, i.e. the judge, and one is where he's saying it on the person himself, that is the oath itself. And we need both cases. Because if we just had the case of the judges, their Rameir would say you could go back. Because he didn't really fully establish in himself to pay his friend if the judges will obligate him. Because he says, I'm not sure that they're going to rule for the other person. Where he basically says to his friend, you take this oath, maybe he'll agree with the rabbis, because there it's directly upon the person, and so therefore maybe he'll agree with the rabbis and can't go back. The Yashmin and Bahan, if we only had the case of Torah B'das, and if we only had the case that where he relied upon the judges, maybe it's there the rabbis say that he can't go back because he knew. I mean, just the case of the oath. Maybe there the rabbis say he can't go back because it was a real kinyan or it was real basically decision to rely upon them. But in the case of the judges, so now the Gemara now asks a fundamental question. When Rameir says you could go back if you accepted upon yourself to take a disqualified judge or a lesser oath, and the Rabbanan say you can't go back, so says Reish Lakish, Machokas lefnei Mardin. When is there a dispute between Rameir and the Rabbanan? Before the verdict was issued. But after the verdict was issued by this disqualified judge, even Rameir would say you can't go back there because the verdict was issued. Rabbi Yochanan said, no, even after the verdict was issued, that's a dispute. So the Gemara says, wait 1 second. The Gemara says, what's the position of Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan says that the dispute is after the verdict was issued. What's Rabbi Yochanan in effect saying? Is he saying the dispute is after the verdict was issued, but before the verdict was issued, everybody would say, even the Rabbanan would say you could go back. The same thing that we had before, the same question of Rabbi Yochanan. Or is Rabbi Yochanan saying that the dispute is according in both cases, both before and after the verdict? Well, let's try and bring a proof from what Rava said, because Rava said, Kibo lav karov apostle if neg mardin yachol achsabo achar mardin enu yachol achsabo. The Rava said that if he accepted upon himself a relative or a disqualified judge, if it would be Tashma da Amarava, there's so many words on this page, I'm trying to say it quickly. And the Rava says, Tashma da Amarava, Kibo lav karov apostle if neg mardin yachol achsabo achar mardin enu yachol achsabo. The Rava says if it's before, if he accepted upon himself a disqualified judge, if it's before the verdict was issued, he could go back. But after the verdict was issued, he can't go back. Now, if you want to say that we're talking about, so basically Rava says that, and Rava is basically ruling that before the verdict you can go back, and after the verdict you can't go back. Now, if you want to say that the dispute is after the verdict, but before the verdict everybody says you can go back. Rava da Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Valiba de Rabbanan. Rava holds like Rabbi Yochanan, who says the dispute is after the Gemar Din, and like the Rabbanan, who say that you can't go back. But if you're going to say that the dispute is in both cases, Rava, who says that the Amar Kaman, Rava, who's he saying like? Because basically he's saying he's ruling like Rabbi Meir in before Gemar Din, and like Rabbi and like Rabbanan after Gemar Din. Doesn't make sense. It must be that he holds like Rabbi Yochanan according to the Rabbanan that the only dispute is after the verdict. Shema Mina. Shalchei Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda Rav Nachman bar Yaakov Yomdenu Rabbeinu. How do we rule? Is the dispute before the ruling or after the ruling? Who's the law like? The law is after Gemar Din. The law is like after the verdict is issued, and like the Chachamim who say that after the verdict is issued, you can't go back. After the verdict is issued, you can't go back. Rashi Amar Hachi Shalchei. Now this is what he said. Is a dispute where the plaintiff is asking the question, means say, I waive my rights, or where the defendant is the one who's saying, I accept the judge, and that's ateilucha. And where is there the dispute? In which case? And who's the law like? The case is a case of ateilucha, meaning say where the defendant says it, and that's where there's a dispute that the Rebbe Meir says he can go back, and the Chachamim say he can't. And that even in the case of ateilucha, he can't change his mind. But machalucha, everybody would say that he can change his mind and go back. So shalchai ateilucha machokas halacha k'divrei chachamim and besura masneu hachi. But pumadusa masneu hachi. This is how they taught him pumadusa. Amar Chanina bar Shamei shalchoi mibei Rav Shmuel Yamdinu Rabbeinu of Nigmar Din v'kano miyadamai. So let's say it was before the verdict, which we said that we had paskin that even the Chachamim would say you could go back, but they did a kinyan, like a formal agreement, a formal acceptance that these disqualified judges will be the judges. What would be the law there? If you did a formal acceptance, then you can't go back on it. If you signed, like you did a handshake, a TSCAP, kinyan suda, or formal acceptance, sorry, you can't go back on it. And this next Mishnah is such an important Mishnah. Really, we'll do that daf on Shabbos, but I want to start the Mishnah. These are the ones who are disqualified as to be a judge and a witness. If you're a gambler, you play with dice, you go to Vegas, you go to Atlantic City and you gamble, you can't be a witness. And if you're a lender on interest, if you lend money on interest, you're a pigeon racer, the gambler. We'll see two opinions what a pigeon racer is. Is it a gambler or is it somebody who's stealing the other person's pigeons? A person who has doing business in Shemitah year. All these cases are people show that they have a big taiva for money. At first they used to call them the people who gathered up the shviyah, just gathered it up. Gemara is going to explain what that means. Rashi says, what's the problem with somebody who lends money, who does business with the sabbatical year fruit? Since he has such a desire for money, he's violating the Torah. He's like a rasha. He's like a wicked person who's a thief, and therefore he's disqualified because he's going to be easily bribed. That's how Rashi says it. So at first they would call them the Osvei Shviyah, and then they called them Socher Shviyah. And when the strong-armed people increased in the world, they call them those who are doing business in the shviyas, and therefore they had to gather the fruits for the king. So therefore they call these people socher shviyas, meaning to say only those who are doing business, not the ones who are collecting them, were disqualified. And Rabbi Yehuda Emasai, when do we say that Rabbi Yehuda argues with the Tanna Kama? He says, when is the Mesachik Bekuvya and the Mafricha Yonim? When are all these people disqualified? If you're a gambler or if you're a pigeon racer, that's only when that's their only job. But if they have another job, then we're going to say that they are kosher. If they have another job, they're kosher. They're not disqualified. Why? Rashi says, what if that's their only job? That's a big problem. It's not that they can be tempted to be bribed, but because the whole vein asukim yeshuva shalom, since their job is a terrible job, they're not making the world better. They're not asuk. They're not engaged in making the world a better place. They have a terrible job. They're just making money by gambling. So therefore, they're not engaged in the laws of judges, and they don't know it well enough. They don't know the proper way to conduct themselves. They're not fearful of sin. All right, we'll stop here because we have to daven now. A big shkoyach to everybody, and we'll